So this also leads to an interesting case which was reported by Antonio Damasio in his book The Feelings of What Happens, in which he discusses the influence of emotions on our thoughts. And he describes one patient, David, who in many ways is similar to HM because he has a very severe loss of memory abilities. So he's basically unable to remember anything almost. So in many ways much more severe than HM. And he's living in an institution where at some point the people who were in this institution, the nurses, played a little bit of a trick on him because he was in many ways the story is that he were a heavy smoker and therefore very often was out of cigarettes. So he would be asking the nurses for cigarettes. So during 1 week, some of the nurses decided that only one of them was going to give him cigarettes. And so whenever he was asking one of the other nurses, he would say no, whereas one of them would say yes, and he would get cigarettes. And then it was interesting that during that week, he would almost completely avoid the nurse who wouldn't give him cigarettes. And whenever they had dinner or whatever, he would come and sit by the nurse who would be giving him cigarettes. The next week, they then swapped roles, and the other one would give him cigarettes and the other one would not. And then he would choose to go with the nurse who was giving him cigarettes that week. Even though he had no recollection of which was which nurse, because he couldn't establish that memory, he had no remembering consciously about who actually gave him the cigarettes and who did not. So again, it's an emotional response. He becomes happy because she gives him cigarette and it's associated with something good, so therefore he decides to go with her rather than the other one. And it swaps just like that. So where is then all of this different memory located? And especially when we go to the long-term memory. One of the first attempts to try and localize memory was done by Carl Lashley back in the 1920s and 1930s. And what he basically did was to chop away different parts of the brain in rats and seeing how good they were at finding their way through a maze. And what he reported was basically that the larger lesion he made, the percentage of cortex destroyed, the worse the rats were at finding their way through the maze. And what he argued was that long-term memory is something which requires all of the cortex. It's not in one particular part of the cortex which is involved. It's just simply the more you remove, the more of an effect you get. And that's, to some extent, it's both correct and wrong. First of all, that there is certainly a problem in just removing cortex without actually looking at what is inside that cortex, because certainly you then remove areas which also will influence the sensory capability of the rat. If you remove some of the visual cortex, for instance, that could have an interference with the ability of the rat to find its way. If you interfere with some of the other sensory abilities of the rat, it might not be able to sense as many things as necessary in order to make its way through the maze. But basically, the idea is that long-term memory is distributed to a lot of different areas in the brain, and that our recollection of certain events, of certain facts, our declarative memory is really distributed in very many areas. So when we remember a certain event, there is some visual content, there's some emotional content, there is some olfactory content, maybe there's a taste involved in it, and all of those different qualities of that event will be stored in different areas of the brain.